More than 170 million cases, over 3 million deaths, a total financial loss of more than $8 trillion, and it's not yet over. The Wuhan virus pandemic is the worst health crisis that the world has seen in 100 years. It all began 18 months ago. We are still paying the price for China's worst ever export. And we still don't know how it all began. How did the Wuhan virus come into being? Global opinion is split. Some say the virus came from a bat, an animal reservoir. Some point fingers at the wet market in Wuhan. Scientists in China say it came from frozen foods. But until recently, no one was ready to back what now seems the likeliest explanation for what happened in Wuhan: an accidental lab leak. There's a flood of new reports and mounting evidence. What do we make of all of this? We reached out to the world's top experts, women and men, who are leading the origin debate and investigation. Over the next 1 hour, we'll speak to the scientists who are studying the findings and the experts who are leading the investigation. While it may be premature to arrive at a conclusion right now, our hope is to make sense of the events as they are unfolding. We begin with our first guest of the day.
Born in the United Kingdom in 1942, Nicholas Wade is a science writer, editor, and author. In a career spanning well over 4 decades, Wade has worked with the world's leading science publications like Nature and Science, and written several books. In 1982, Wade joined the New York Times as a science writer, and eventually went on to edit the well-renowned section of the newspaper. His most recent piece, The Origin of COVID, Did People or Nature Open Pandora's Box at Wuhan?, has enabled a shift in public opinion and restarted the debate on the possibility of a laboratory leak.
The lab leak theory is almost as old as this pandemic. We've been reporting it since February last year, but it remained caught in a web of conspiracy theories and unverified facts. Now that has changed, and a lot of credit for that goes to our guest today, science journalist, editor, and writer Nicholas Wade. Nicholas Wade, welcome to WION.
Thank you.
First of all, congratulations. We know what it's like to stand your ground against overwhelming pressure by vested interests to kill a story that you believe in. And we on WION call it the Wuhan virus, and we've been banned for it. So I can only imagine the kind of pushback that you faced, but you stuck to your guns, so kudos to you.
Thank you.
We are going to start from the beginning, Nicholas. It was towards the end of December 2019 when we first heard about the outbreak in Wuhan and we began reporting about it. At that time, the cases were few. The World Health Organization had declared that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. But for some reason, things did not add up. Something wasn't sitting right, at least for us. When did you hear about this virus, and what did you think at that time?
Well, I heard about it at the same time, and I think I probably assumed that it was a natural outbreak because we had already had 2 previous epidemics, SARS-1 in 2002 and MERS in 2012. So a natural outbreak seemed the more plausible.
So at what point did you think that this wasn't a natural outbreak after all?
It was in April of last year. I read an article on the internet by Yuri Dagin, who's a biotech entrepreneur, and he explained how you could take this virus apart and reassemble it. He showed you all the working parts and which ones might have been introduced in a lab. He didn't endorse the idea of a lab leak, but he showed how it was very possible to manipulate the virus. And this, I think, put on the table the idea that the virus could have been manipulated and in the lab, and it showed certain signs of this manipulation, and therefore it could have escaped because lab escapes are not that rare.
When the virus began spreading towards the West, there was a marked shift in the way leaders assessed this outbreak. Initially, Donald Trump, for instance, called it a flu that will go away. But once it began spreading in the US, Trump called it an engineered virus and a bioweapon. And these claims were quickly dismissed. More than a year later, we're all discussing a potential lab leak again, and seriously so. Do you think that this theory was dismissed instantly, mostly because it was Donald Trump who was backing it?
No, it was dismissed mostly because 2 small groups of virologists published letters in leading scientific journals, one in The Lancet, the other in Nature Medicine. And these two letters said that it was out of the question that the virus had been manipulated, that anyone who said so was pushing a conspiracy theory and hated the Chinese, and that the virus had certainly originated in a natural way. So these two letters captured the public narrative, and all major newspapers just accepted it. All their science journalists failed to probe the basis of these two letters, and it just became accepted wisdom. Now, Donald Trump was extremely unhelpful in saying, without producing any evidence, that the virus definitely came from the Wuhan lab, because this polarized the discussion in the US, and it set people even further into their preconceived views. So this more or less made it impossible for anyone to give serious consideration to the lab leak theory for over a year.
So you're saying it's largely because of lack of evidence rather than politics at play?
It was more than lack of evidence. It was that a small group of virologists who of course, had a deep interest in this not being a lab leak because of the scrutiny this would bring down on their own activities and their own funding. These virologists assured everyone that, speaking as experts, they could tell the public, they could assure the public there was no way that this virus could have been manipulated. And that was a false assurance. They were going way beyond their scientific knowledge in telling the public that. And that was a serious error on their part. It was a serious error on the part of scientific journals to publish such papers, and also, it seems, to delay the publication of papers that might have pointed toward lab leak. It was a failure of many institutions, the scientific community, the scientific journals, the mainstream media. All these institutions failed to do their proper job, and this is why we were saddled with the idea that lab leak was an impossibility for more than a year.
It wasn't just the small group of scientists. They weren't just saying that this was not a possibility. They were pushing back very actively whenever someone discussed the possibility of a lab leak. The very idea was considered criminal. I remember that one of our interviews on the subject was tagged as fake news by Facebook. You say that this is a failure. Were you surprised at the response of these scientists and so-called experts?
I'm very surprised at the present response, because almost overnight, everyone has gone from assuming lab leak was an impossibility to assuming it's the more probable explanation.
What do you think contributed to this shift?
I think it's a very complex set of reasons, and I don't pretend to know them all. I think the stage was set in a very important way by the visit of the World Health Organization a committee of inquiry to Beijing in February of this year. So at first sight, there seemed to be a propaganda victory for the Chinese, who had more or less handpicked the members of the committee, and the committee duly reported that lab leak was extremely unlikely and they weren't going to waste any time on it, and natural emergence was the only way the virus could have originated. But what people came to realize, I think, was that the Chinese had failed to provide a shred of evidence in favor of natural emergence to this inquiry committee. So however plausible natural emergence seemed at first, we had now gone, 15 months, and no evidence for it had emerged. This was very odd, because the two previous epidemics have left copious traces in the environment of their emergence. So I think it was the reactions to the World Health Organization committee that turned people's mind into thinking, well, natural emergence seems much less likely than it did at first, so maybe we should open our minds to the other possibility, the escape of a manipulated virus from a lab. I think that had a lot to do with it.
That's a very interesting take, I have to say, because all this while the narrative has been focused on the fact that the WHO team could not find evidence. You're saying that it was China that failed to provide evidence that this may have been a naturally originating virus. But coming back to the pushback, one of those who led the strong pushback against the claims of a lab leak initially was was a man called Peter Daszak, the president of EcoHealth Alliance. And in your piece, you mention how Daszak orchestrated a statement in The Lancet to label the possibility of a leak as a conspiracy theory. How do you assess Daszak's role in what has happened?
Well, Dr. Daszak has been at the center of all this because, as you say, he's president of the EcoHealth Alliance in New York, and the National Institutes of Health gave him a large grant, which he in turn passed on to the Wuhan Institute of Technology to do research on coronaviruses. That's the kind of virus that infects bats and causes these epidemics. So he was right in the middle of it, and of course he would stand to be blamed if indeed the virus had leaked from research that he had funded. So he had an enormous conflict of interest in the Lancet letter, which it turns out he had organized and drafted and got several people connected with his organization to sign it. This conflict of interest should, of course, have been declared to the Lancet readers, and the editors of the Lancet should have made sure that this happened, but they didn't. And indeed, the letter concludes, "We declare no conflict of interest." So this is not how affairs should be conducted. Dr. Daszak certainly put himself in a very awkward position by claiming he had no conflict when he certainly did.
And what does this say about the credibility of journals like the Lancet and others that dismiss this theory without due diligence?
I think there's going to be a serious inquiry into the role of scientific journals like Lancet and Nature and the role they have played in this. I think it seems they have acted extremely irresponsibly. Instead of being neutral scientific recorders of the fact, they have put their thumb on the scale in favor of natural emergence and against lab leak when they had no evidence for doing so. There was no reason to favor one theory over another. And Nature should have allowed both sides to present their views. That's the duty of a leading scientific journal. Instead, Nature published letters from the virologists who dismissed lab leak, and not only that, it has put warning notices on various other papers it has published to do with manipulation of coronaviruses. If you look up these papers, you'll see a note from the editors saying, this paper has been cited by people who believe in lab leak and experts have rejected it. It's clearly putting their thumb on the scales. It's terribly inappropriate. And I think that the owners of Nature need to look very seriously into their editorial policy and to revise it completely so that no one has any reason to believe that Nature does the bidding of the Chinese government.
Scientific journals are one part of the story. The other is the agencies that fund such research. It has emerged that Peter Daszak was contributing and distributing millions of dollars in American grant money. And some of it also went to the Wuhan lab. What have you managed to find out about the connection between American grants and the Wuhan laboratory in China?
Well, this is all an open process and there's nothing particularly sinister in it. These grants came from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of the National Institutes of Health in the USA. And this is the leading biomedical funding agency. So the NIAID looks after funding for virology and infectious diseases. So because these two previous epidemics had originated from bat viruses, probably in China, the agency had a very legitimate interest in keeping tabs on these viruses, in trying to study them, and in collaborating with the leading Chinese expert on coronaviruses, Dr. Zhengli Shi, who works at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So this is a completely open process. It was the correct policy, and I see no reason why the National Institutes of Health should be faulted for it. But the open question, though, is whether Dr. Shi at the Wuhan Institute was manipulating viruses in dangerous ways that were not permitted by her grant. And this is called gain of function, when you take a virus and you manipulate it in such a way as to make it more infectious, more dangerous to health than it was before. So she was certainly doing this kind of experiment. and it remains to be seen if she was going beyond the terms of her grant in doing so.
Right, and I will come back to Dr. Sheen a bit, but my last question on Peter Daszak, he's had a lot to say about your piece, and he's called it, and I'm quoting, biased, disingenuous, and wildly erroneous. How do you respond?
Well, that's just rhetoric. Let him provide some facts, and then we can consider them.
In recent weeks, Dr. Anthony Fauci has also faced questions over the decision to allow American dollars to flow into the Wuhan laboratory. Do you think the United States or Dr. Fauci knew that American grants were being used for risky research in China?
Well, that's a very important question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. Now, Dr. Fauci has assured the Senate that he did not fund any gain-of-function research. Which is hard to reconcile with what Dr. Shi was actually doing, which certainly seems to be gain-of-function research. So the best explanation I've found at present is that there are sort of two definitions of gain-of-function. So one is the sort of common sense definition. You're just sort of changing the virus's genome by genetically manipulating it in a way that risks its infectivity being increased. That's the common sense definition. I think that's what Dr. Shi was doing. However, the law under which Dr. Fauci was operating had a much narrower, more precise definition of gain of function. And I suspect Dr. Fauci will turn out to be correct in that, according to that narrow legal definition, he was not funding, or he did not intend to fund any gain of function research.
Dr. Fauci has also called on China to release medical records of researchers from the Wuhan lab. But for the better part of last year, he was an advocate of a natural spillover. What do you think made him change his mind?
I don't know what made him change his mind. That's a very interesting question. Certainly, very early on, he was warned by a group of virologists led by Dr. Christian Andersen that their first impression on looking at the virus was that it was man-made. So this was a very electrifying conclusion, which came to light just last week when emails exchanged with Dr. Fauci were released to reporters under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, this group then changed its mind and published a letter in Nature Medicine, which was one of the two letters we mentioned, which was so influential in capturing the public narrative. The Andersen letter, as published, came to the completely opposite conclusion, saying there was no way this could have been man-made. So we don't know what made the Andersen group change their mind. It's very unclear. We don't know what made Dr. Fauci change his mind recently, or indeed to ignore the Andersen group's first impression that this was man-made. I think there's a lot more that has to be understood about this. It may be Dr. Fauci thought, well, if the facts are uncertain, instead of bothering the public, we should just sort of stick with the plausible explanation that it's natural emergence, and I'll stick with that until contrary evidence emerges. That may have been his view, and that could explain why he's changed his mind in recent days.
Let's discuss the lab now, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What is it about this laboratory that makes the possibility of a leak so plausible?
Well, what makes leaks so extremely plausible was that he was working on these bat viruses, on coronaviruses, and we know that it was manipulating them. Specifically, it was taking the spike proteins from some viruses and inserting them into the backbone or the genome of another. So these spike proteins are what determines the host that the virus will attack. So they're very important in controlling the virus's behavior. So this is just the kind of experiment that could have led to the creation of SARS-CoV-2.
And we've done a lot of reports ourselves on the Wuhan lab. It is classified as a biosafety level 4 lab, which is the highest safety classification for any facility of this kind. Are such facilities still prone to leaks?
The BSL-4 labs, I don't think there has been a leak from them. The leaks usually occur when people take material from a BSL-4 lab, thinking it's sort of safe or inert or some reason, and they transfer it to a lower level safety lab, and then there's a leak from the lower level safety lab.
You mentioned Dr. Shi Zhengli. Since the world began probing the origins of the virus all over again, Dr. Shi has defended herself, and I'm quoting from what she said, that she guarantees on her life, those are her words, that this pandemic had nothing to do with her laboratory. But we reported this earlier on how a database of around 22,000 virus samples and sequences was taken offline by the Wuhan lab. Now, this happened in September 2019. Dr. Shi claims that the database was removed to prevent hacking during the pandemic. The pandemic began only in January and was declared one in March 2020. The database was deleted in September 2019. It doesn't add up. And this is just one example. What are the more obvious inconsistencies that you have spotted in the Chinese version of events?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I think almost everything Dr. Shi says is under the control of the Communist Party, so it cannot be relied on, and in many cases it has shown to be incorrect. For example, this whole affair probably started when 6 miners in the Mojiang district of southwestern China became very ill with a bat virus and died. And this caught the attention of Dr. Shi and I think many other people in China, because here was a lethal virus that simply for public health reasons one would need to investigate. Now, Dr. Shi subsequently tried to cover up, it would seem, her initial investigation of this virus. For example, she changed the name of the virus from bat-CoV-4991, which she originally reported it under, to RATG13 without mentioning this in her paper. This is not good practice, and it is in fact deceptive. She also said that the miners had died of a fungus disease, not of coronaviruses. But we know from a PhD thesis written by a student that in fact they did die of coronavirus-like infection. So there are quite a large number of ways in which we can see that Dr. Shi's statements cannot be relied on, and I think we must consider that these are part of a very large-scale cover-up by the Chinese government. Not only are they concealing all the records in the Wuhan Institute, closing off databases, as you said, in September 2019, a very odd date to close it off, but also everything they do put out is designed for a purpose of supporting the natural emergence theory.
Speaking of a cover-up, the WHO's role has come into question. A top official of the World Health Organization has now said that they cannot force China to give more information about the origins. I remember last year we'd asked for an interview with WHO Director General Dr. Tedros, and after he publicly agreed to one, the WHO press team got in touch with us saying that we'll only get an opportunity to ask a question at a press conference. We have tracked the WHO's role in this pandemic, and it has been found to be wanting. What kind of damage do you think this episode, this pandemic, has done to the credibility of the World Health Organization?
Well, the report on the origins of the coronavirus has certainly done serious damage to the organization's reputation and perception of its independence. I think in retrospect, the WHO should have refused to send an inquiry commission to Beijing if the conditions that the Chinese required were unacceptable, as the WHO should have judged them to be. And the Chinese government more or less handpicked the members of the committee. It sort of decreed what they could and could not see. It didn't allow them to perform any research. They just had to accept the data given them by Chinese scientists. I think the WHO should have said, well, we cannot do a proper investigation under these conditions, and you, China, are to blame for preventing our inquiry, and there's nothing more we can do at present.
Now, the United States is conducting its own assessment into the origins. Do you expect something tangible to come out of this, considering the time that has passed and the lack of access that they will definitely encounter as they proceed?
It remains to be seen what they're going to find. I mean, it's possible that intelligence communities, if they sort of go back and look very carefully at all the data they've stored, at satellite photos, recorded conversations, if that's what they do, they may find lots of sort of pieces of information which, when put together in a framework, may allow them to draw more definitive conclusion.
After a cover-up in the initial days and silencing whistleblowers, the Chinese state is now pushing back on demands of another investigation. Is there any way then to ensure more transparency or cooperation from Beijing?
Well, I think there is an obvious way, and that is for all countries outside China to conduct a very careful survey of the available evidence themselves, and for their scientists groups or other groups to issue reports saying, well, we think on present evidence that lab leak is more likely. And if all the world is saying lab leak is more likely, then for the first time, pressure will build on China to stop stonewalling and to provide the information, which after all might prove it innocent if it releases all the records of the Wuhan Institute. I think China's now faces a rather difficult choice. Now, one possibility is that having seen that people are no longer accepting the natural emergence theory, China may suddenly provide actual, quote, evidence in favor of natural emergence. So I think a lot of the world would look on any such evidence with deep suspicion at this point, but the Chinese may figure, well, it will confuse enough people to let us carry on this route of deception. The other choice China has, of course, would be to come clean, to cooperate with the West. There's a sort of face-saving formula at hand in that the Americans, as you've said, supported this research at the Wuhan Institute, which they shouldn't have done if it was dangerous. So the Chinese could say, well, it's true, we let it escape from our lab, but Americans were supporting it, so there's enough blame to go around for both sides. And under that formula, the Chinese could then reverse their policy and open up all their records. I'm not saying that's at all likely, but I think if China sort of seriously considers the alternative, that it's going to be shunned by the rest of the world for the foreseeable future for having unleashed this terrible epidemic, I think certain people in China will decide the wiser course is now to cooperate.
Well, that's the best case scenario, isn't it? And in the last 1 year, what we've seen and what we've clearly noted is that while we try to join the dots, it's very hard to depend on the data coming out of China because you cannot independently verify it. You cannot take the statements at face value, as you said in the case of Dr. Shi. So as the evidence piles up, and we have mostly circumstantial evidence, what kind of sort of clinching proof does the world need to conclusively say now that this pandemic was indeed a result of a lab leak? And have you found any leads worth pursuing during the course of your investigation?
Well, I think the first question we should ask ourselves is, do we really need clinching proof? Because clinching proof would be the records of Dr. Shi's lab, that she was working on a certain coronavirus, that she inserted the spike protein and another element called the furin cleavage site. If all those records exist, that will be the clinching proof. But as you've indicated, it's not very likely the Chinese are going to hand that over. So I therefore think we should consider going to a lesser standard of proof, but after all, one that is used in all our courts, and that is of a convincing mass of circumstantial evidence. So I think that kind of evidence could be built up without too much difficulty, if indeed this is lab leak.
We'll have to see where it goes, though. Thanks very much, Nicholas Wade, for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us.
You're very welcome.
You just heard from the man who brought the spotlight back on the lab leak theory. Now let's discuss the evidence at hand. It's mostly circumstantial. What do experts make of it, though? Does a natural origin still look like the most probable scenario? Is a lab leak the more compelling explanation? How do we get to the bottom of this pandemic mystery? And when will the world get the answers that we've been looking for? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by a special panel of experts. We have with us Oksana Paisik, lecturer and global health advisor, University College London. She's joining us from London. Dr. Amish Adalja, senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. He's joining us from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Dr. Rasmus Nielsen, professor of integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Nielsen is one of the 18 scientists who recently signed a letter published in the journal Science calling for further investigation into the origins. And from Pune in India, we are joined by Dr. Monali Rahalkar, a scientist at the Agrakar Research Institute. Dr. Rahalkar has been working with Drastic, which is a team of experts and researchers investigating the origins of the virus using open source information. Welcome to all of you on WION.
Hello.
Oksana Paisik, let me begin with you. 18 months after it all began, we know a lot about the behavior of the virus, and we know that what are the ways to keep it under control, but we still don't know much about the origins of the virus. Where do you think it came from?
Well, currently we have heard a lot about some of the 4 hypotheses that the World Health Organization first put forward as possibilities as to how this coronavirus came to be. And the 2 that are currently being most widely discussed are, of course, the zoonotic transmission, meaning it's skipped from animals to humans. And then the theory that the WHO, after their field investigation dubbed as the least likely, is the lab leak theory. Lab leaks do happen occasionally. We can go to 1977 looking at the Russian flu, which actually did not originate in Russia at all, but was linked to China. We know that lab leaks can occur, but it was dubbed to be not the leading theory due to the fact that almost all coronaviruses that we are currently aware of, SARS, MERS, etc., have made a zoonotic leak, and that this spillover then was thought to be more likely. So through a science lens, this has been the leading theory. However, when we start to look at the picture more holistically, and particularly through a security lens, the fact that the WHO wasn't allowed into the country, because they have to be invited by the government, by the Chinese Communist Party, for at least a year into the investigation, means that there have been some suspicions that perhaps there's more to the story than what just we are able to tell from the genomic sequence itself.
Rasmus Nielsen, last year when the possibility of the lab leak was raised initially, it was instantly dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Now it has gained steam. What made you sign the letter calling for further investigation?
Well, I'd like to say first that I think that we still have a theory of a zoonotic transfer that I don't think that we can dismiss so easily. For example, using arguments about the way the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government has been suppressing information. I think we see that today through the actions they had on the WHO team and various other actions. But we have to understand that it might be part of an attempt from the Chinese government to simply control the entire narrative about COVID-19, not necessarily because there was a lab leak. So I think we shouldn't just jump to the conclusion that because China behaves as if it has something to hide, that there actually is something to hide. It might just simply be an attempt to tightly control, particularly with respect to their own population, the narrative about COVID-19. I think there are many arguments that you could give for why it is not a lab leak. And I think the most important argument is that humans get into contact with bats and other natural sources of viruses all the time. Why is it exactly that the virus that was in a lab that would then cause the pandemic is a very, very little fraction of the amount of human virus contact? I still think that that's a strong argument. When we decided to go out with this letter anyway, despite these arguments, I would say there's, for me personally, and I can't speak on behalf of the other people signing the letter, but for me personally, there's 2 reasons. The first one is that we realized that the kind of research that's been done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology has been done in BSL-2 labs. That's very low security labs. There's a lot of talk about one of the few BSL-4 labs in China is in Wuhan. I'm not so concerned about that. I'm concerned about that we know now all the coronavirus research was done in a BSL-2 lab. That's not much more secure than sort of your average high school chemistry room laboratory. The other reason is, of course, that we were disappointed with the WHO report. We had hoped that we wouldn't have to go out and insert ourselves in this debate, that there's a process going on trying to investigate the origins, but it's clear that with the WHO report that there wasn't a real fair process really trying to engage in a balanced way on trying to find the origins of the virus. So we felt it was necessary to go out and remind people the lab leak theory is actually still on the table, and we really should investigate that theory so we can better be prepared for preventing the next epidemic from emerging.
Indeed, very interesting points. Amy Shadalja, the only investigators who got some kind of access to the Wuhan laboratory were those from the World Health Organization. But then this team was handpicked by China, as we all know, and their probe was more of a guided tour. What do you make of the WHO investigation report, and do you find any obvious gaps in it?
Most of us in the field realized that the WHO report was not going to be conclusive, that it was going to be tightly controlled and heavily influenced by the Chinese government. So whatever the conclusion was, it wasn't going to be something that actually pointed to a path to understand the origin of this virus and how it went from bats into humans. So it was immediately discounted by many in the field as being biased and having a lot of conflicts of interest with researchers who are doing research with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on that panel. So what it really underscores is the need for an independent, transparent investigation, which may never come, but that's what's needed to understand how this virus found its way from bats into humans and then started a global pandemic.
Monali Rahelkar, the Wuhan seafood market was earlier considered to be the original source of the virus, ground zero as they call it. But when you began your research last year, digging into Chinese papers, you found circumstantial evidence, I understand, suggesting a link between the pandemic and the Wuhan laboratory. What did you find?
Yes. So picking on this, I would like to say that when we started the research last year, 1 year ago, we found an evidence that there was a mine shaft in south of China. The south of China is hotspot for the horseshoe bats, which are the reservoirs for the SARS-CoV-2 and also SARS-1. So there were 6 miners which went to clean this mine, which was filled with bat feces, and they got severe pneumonia. We dug deeper into this, and there was a Chinese master thesis found by a drastic member called Seeker, and eventually when we published a preprint, we joined this particular Twitter group and studied the master thesis. Now the pneumonia symptoms were very similar to COVID-19, and the fact that Wuhan Institute of Virology visited this particular mine from 2012 to 2015 and brought several samples from there, including 9 SARS-like coronaviruses. So this is like a circumstantial evidence that so many SARS-like coronaviruses, including the nearest neighbor of present SARS-2, were being brought to WIV. They were being researched, and RATG13 was also sequenced in 2018, whereas they told us that it was sequenced in 2020. So this is the link from Yunnan to Wuhan Institute of Virology, and so I think we should go deeper into the lab hypothesis, because there are several such evidences.
Rasmus Nielsen, Peter Daszak was part of the team that traveled to Wuhan, and his organization, the Eco Health Alliance, as we've all reported repeatedly, has funded research at the Wuhan lab through American grants. Was the WHO investigation tainted by conflict of interest?
I mean, I think it was unfortunate that long-time collaborators with Wuhan Institute of Virology was on the WHO team. I think now in hindsight, I think the WHO must also be able to see that, because it would raise further doubts on and raises issues about the credibility of the report and the objectives of the mission. So I would agree that that was unfortunate.
Amy Shadalja, reports say that the WHO team spent 3 hours in the Wuhan laboratory and they were unable to examine any of the safety logs or records of testing on its staff. How do you think they concluded that a lab leak then was the least likely of possibilities?
It's really an arbitrary conclusion on their part. They didn't really have the evidence to be able to say that. And we know that what they were granted access to was very limited and very controlled by the Chinese government. And it's more than lab logs. They need to actually speak candidly to some of the individuals who work there to ask them what type of biosafety procedures are in place. Did anybody get ill? Are there medical records there of people who got ill in November that we heard about in the Wall Street Journal? I really don't think that anything that the WHO panel concluded can be taken at face value. It really is not an objective investigation. It is an investigation that was heavily tainted by the Chinese government and not something that was ever going to get into the origin of this virus. And it really should just be dismissed as something that was more of a show inspection, a show investigation, than actually one that was substantive or probative.
Monali Rahalkar, one of the reasons why the lab leak theory is being taken seriously is a 2012 incident when 6 miners went to a bat cave, as you said, and fell sick. And it is believed that the samples found from those mines are the closest in lineage to the current virus. What do we know about these samples beyond what has come in the news? And have you found anything that suggests that these samples were being manipulated in the Wuhan laboratory?
Okay, so regarding the samples, initially Wuhan Institute of Virology told us that they only collected the samples between 2012 to 2013, but later Zheng Shi added in an addendum to her Nature paper, that was in November 2020, 11 months after the pandemic, that she told that they collected 2 more years, they went there 2 more years and they collected samples. She also, I think, told in a webinar that the mine was closed for other people. So there is no chance, that other people entering this particular mine. So all these samples were brought to Wuhan Institute of Virology. RATG13 virus was sequenced in 2018, completely sequenced. Now the kind of work WIV was doing, for example, they were creating chimeric viruses, so taking backbone of a virus and then spike of another virus and testing them in humanized mice. So, one hypothesis could be that if RATG13 was used as a backbone sequence and then either by serial passage or by synthetic creation of the virus, if some other virus could have been made, then this could have led to the current SARS-CoV-2. That could be one hypothesis. Or another one could be that the miners which were ill, did they isolate any live virus from the miners or the other live viruses from the other samples? So WIV has not published anything on the mine shaft samples, apart from only one paper was published in 2016. So this looks rather suspicious because they had a lot of samples from there.
Right. Oksana Paisik, the evidence is piling up. A recent report said that 3 researchers from the Wuhan lab had taken ill in November 2019, weeks before China officially declared its first case. Now, Dr. Anthony Fauci has asked China to release their medical records. What kind of evidence do you think is the American intelligence looking for here?
Well, certainly it would be important to see that whether there are still samples of that could indicate either antibodies or anything associated with COVID-19. But again, it's very unlikely that those samples are still available. We do know that these workers, again, had COVID-like symptoms and were hospitalized. But then again, many respiratory infections will share similar types of symptoms. So we cannot say based on that evidence alone, but it certainly did raise the alarm amongst many around looking, again, not at the wider mosaic. There's certainly more interesting questions being raised, particularly as it was within this facility itself. However, again, the WHO is a UN agency. It represents all member states. It cannot compel China to produce these samples of the health lab workers, even if they do exist. So again, this puts the WHO in a very difficult position because bulldozing China, especially Beijing, will not lead towards any more answers. So we do need some sort of diplomatic route forward.
Do you think it's too late then to investigate the virus because most of the evidence may have been destroyed, or it may be too late to find those samples, as you just said?
Well, we still haven't taken the zoonotic theory off the table either. So that needs to continue alongside understanding what was going on within that lab, the workers themselves. Were there anyone else in association with those workers that could have been potentially affected? Again, we only have to go as far as 2003 to see that China's track record around transparency, even with that first SARS outbreak, wasn't very good. And the previous WHO DG came down hard initially, and that really was helpful in ensuring that only about 30 countries were affected by that first SARS outbreak back in 2003. But unfortunately, this is a pattern of behavior here that means that it's very difficult to get direct answers.
So where do we go from here then? Amish Adalja, this is a question for you. Does the U.S. intelligence have any tangible leads to take this forward? They have ordered a probe. U.S. President Joe Biden has ordered a probe based on America's internal assessment. Do they have leads to pursue over the next 3 months that could improve the world's understanding about the origins?
I'm sure they have leads, and I'm sure they have sources that they're trying to query about what may have happened in those early days of the pandemic in China. Again, as the other panelists have said, it may be the case that we don't find out what the ultimate origin is, but I think it is really important because this is not going to be the last coronavirus emergency that we face. There's a whole family of viruses there that could threaten humans, and I think it's very important that we understand the origin of this virus. If there is an intermediate animal between bats and humans, we need to know what that is because that will change how we prepare. If this was a biosafety lapse, it also will be important because we can share that knowledge with the world because there are many other labs that work with dangerous viruses as well, and we want there to be a norm when there is an accident, that people report it, that people learn from it, and people take corrective action so it doesn't happen again. So I think that this is very important that we try and understand what the origin is, even if we come up empty, because this should be the international norm, especially when you're talking about a virus that has killed millions of people and disrupted the world. We need to know how this all occurred and what those early days were like.
Rasmus Nielsen, it's quite obvious that China is not going to give access until something dramatic happens. So in the event that the second probe, whenever it is ordered, still goes through the same motions as the first one, and the Chinese dictate how it is conducted. What are the alternative ways to investigate this? Because China, on its own, has been pushing its theories about the origins. It claims that the virus has come from imported frozen foods. Is there any merit to this argument either?
So there was a couple of questions. The frozen food, I mean, it's certainly a possibility. I think it's not a very likely possibility that there was a transfer through frozen food from an epidemic that somehow started somewhere else. It's hard to see a scenario where that SARS-CoV-2 can, in fact, in theory, and there have been some cases in China, transmit through frozen food. But it's arising like that, I think, is not something that most epidemiologists would say is a likely explanation. With regards to what other evidence or how else this could be investigated, of course, as the intelligence agencies, they may have some information. Other than that, we have to rely on, unfortunately, on cooperation with China. And I want to make a point here in terms of now we hear a lot of critique of the WHO mission, and I sort of agree with all of those issues that have been raised. But there's also a valid argument that if you don't cooperate with China, we will not learn anything at all. So there's a balance there also to consider that perhaps, maybe I'm being naive here, but perhaps we could, over some years, China might open up to more bilateral collaboration on some of these issues.
Cooperate is a euphemism when dealing with China. I think you basically play it by the rules, or you don't play at all. Monali Rahalkar, while the Wuhan Institute of Virology has got the world's attention, there are, I understand, other facilities in China that have in the past handled coronaviruses, including SARS. In fact, there's been a lab leak in Beijing in 2004. Are there any other such labs in Wuhan or in China that must be made a part of this investigation, a second investigation, whenever it happens?
Yes, I think in Wuhan there were three research institutes. WIB was one, but Wuhan CDC also worked on bat coronaviruses. And you must have seen a video of Tian. There was a researcher who had caught thousands of bats, and he was, experimenting on them without any safety measures. And even Wuhan University also had research on coronaviruses. There were total 23. Drastic has found that there were total 23 labs in Wuhan with different safety levels. And my main concern about this particular thing is that even if we find the origin or not, we should try hard. But in order to avoid the next pandemic, I think the safety measures, for example, they were working in BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs with such dangerous pathogens. And secondly, they were bringing these coronavirus samples from remote caves to such a crowded city like Wuhan. Such things should be avoided, because if they go on continuing getting all these natural dangerous viruses to Wuhan again, there could be also a possibility that a natural virus, not a lab-made one, but a natural virus present in some sample could infect human beings in future. So I think this all work should be restricted, and I think there should be serious thought about this thing.
Question of the role of the scientific community and experts. Amish Adalja, what do you make of the role of scientific journals, for instance, during this pandemic? In the first year, they aggressively pushed back against even the possibility of a lab leak without, as it turns out, giving it due consideration.
What I think happened is that the lab leak hypothesis got bundled together with ideas about biological weapons, by intentional use or genetic engineering of the virus. And all three of them were handled by the press as the same hypothesis when they're really distinct hypotheses. So there was less evidence or no evidence for this being a biological weapon or being a deliberately engineered virus. However, the lab leak was treated as part of that same line of inquiry, and that's why it was dismissed. And I think journalists should think about how that was all presented, because these were distinct possibilities. And I think the rhetoric that was going on in the United States with President Trump against China also was influencing the way the press reported on this, because there was so much acrimony over some of the actions that President Trump was taking, the way he was speaking about the virus, that I think it all kind of clouded what was a legitimate inquiry into laboratory biosafety in China and the ultimate origins of this virus.
Indeed, and whether we like it or not, I think politics plays a part in how this narrative shapes up. Rasmus Nielsen, after Joe Biden ordered a probe, China has responded by calling for an investigation into the Fort Detrick lab in the United States. Would you say this is an attempt at spreading misinformation and sowing doubt? And what role do you think the scientific community can play in bringing some sanity into this debate about the origin of the virus?
Yeah, I don't really want to go into the rhetoric between China and the United States. And as you all know, the United States in many ways also not free of faults for many things in this world. I think what we have to do as scientists is relate to the facts and try to see how many facts we can get. And then those facts have to tell us, we have to sort of assign probabilities to different scenarios based on those facts. But I think it's very important for us not to get caught up in this the sort of more political aspects of it in the dialogue between the United States and China.
Monali Rahalkar, there's a lot at play. There's scientific leanings, there are vested interests, there is politics. You've been investigating the origins from the outside. How do you think the next phase of the probe should be conducted? Deliver very much, and we don't see the circumstances fundamentally table.
Yes, we were hoping that, the World Health Assembly would decide something, but right now there is no big decision as such. I think right now we can depend on the intelligence what the US would put into this. Secondly, as we have this drastic team, and plus we have a group of other scientists who are looking into the origins of this virus. We are looking at the metagenomic data of the early patients, and there are some interesting findings. And so I think we should look at the science, and there are some things which come up one after the other. So the open source intelligence is working, and I think so such this drastic group detectives or the other scientists which are working on this very seriously, I think they could get some breakthrough in this, along with the intelligence, if they put things properly. Like, for example, if we get more details about the samples which are present in the blood banks in China, we could know when did this pandemic started, actually, the date, and also the databases which are missing, if they are open, means if we get access to those. I don't know if they are now in the right conditions. So, but still, I think the open source intelligence, the genomics, and the other data is very important to find out more.
Right. There are lots of ifs in this story, but I'm glad that the whole world has finally decided to pursue it. And from what we understand, G7 leaders are going to call for a new transparent investigation. I think from this conversation, the big takeaways are that the lab leak theory cannot be dismissed. And we do not see China's response changing fundamentally. So we'll have to see how the circumstantial evidence presents itself and take it forward from there. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here on WION.
Thank you for having us.
This week on the West Asia Post, tensions escalate again between US and Iran. The United States seizes Iranian websites. Tehran calls the move not constructive for nuclear talks. What will Raisi's presidency mean for US-Iran relations? Also on the show, what is it like to be queer in West Asia? And how did Yemeni fishermen strike